London, June 1944. The city exhaled smoke and dust from another wave of bombing raids. In the underground bunker beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill sat at a wooden table, reading a single sheet of paper. The room smelled of stale tobacco and anxiety. Around him, senior military officers waited. No one spoke. Churchill folded the paper carefully as if handling something fragile. Then he looked up and said, in a tone so flat it might have been announcing a weather report, "Operation Overlord has commenced. Allied forces are establishing a beachhead in Normandy." That was it. No grand rhetoric. No speeches about destiny or freedom. Just a handful of words, deliberately colorless, spoken with the enthusiasm of a clerk reading an inventory list. To most listeners the announcement seemed almost anticlimactic. But for those who understood what lay beneath those words, the blandness itself was terrifying. Because Churchill's dull delivery wasn't a mistake. It was camouflage. And what it concealed was one of the most audacious deception operations ever conceived. A campaign so vast, so intricate, that it convinced an entire enemy command to prepare for an invasion that would never come. The real weapon wasn't the troops crossing the English Channel. It was the silence around them. The boring tone. The absence of drama. It was the deliberate choice to make the most important military operation in modern history sound unremarkable. Because if Churchill had spoken with fire and passion, the enemy would have known, this is where the blow will land. But by making it sound routine, forgettable, even dull, he planted a seed of doubt. And doubt, in war, can be more lethal than artillery. What most people didn't know, what couldn't be known for decades, was that the invasion of Normandy was only half the story. The other half was happening somewhere else entirely. Or rather, it was happening nowhere at all. By early 1944, the Allied command faced a paradox. They had the men. They had the ships. They had the firepower. But they also had a problem that no amount of steel could solve: geography. The English Channel is only 32 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. From Dover to Calais. If you were planning an invasion of occupied Europe, this was the obvious route. The shortest crossing. The closest to German industrial heartlands. The quickest path to victory. And because it was obvious, it was also the most heavily defended coastline on the planet. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months fortifying the Pas-de-Calais region. Bunkers. Artillery positions. Minefields stretching inland. Entire divisions stationed within hours of the coast. The fortifications were so dense that some Allied planners privately called it the graveyard. If the invasion force tried to land there, they would be shredded before they reached dry sand. But here was the cruel irony: the Germans knew the Allies knew this. They expected deception. They anticipated fake intelligence, false radio traffic, dummy operations. The German high command wasn't naive. They had studied Allied tactics. They knew the British were masters of misdirection, dating back to North Africa, where dummy tanks and fake supply depots had fooled Rommel's reconnaissance planes. So the challenge wasn't just to deceive the enemy. It was to deceive an enemy who expected to be deceived. To create a lie so convincing that even when the truth began to emerge, the enemy would still cling to the lie. This required more than clever tricks. It required building an entire phantom reality. One detailed enough, layered enough, and persistent enough to override what the enemy's own eyes would eventually see. The operation was codenamed Fortitude. And it would become the largest, most elaborate deception in military history. Fortitude was divided into two parts. Fortitude North, which suggested an invasion of Norway, and Fortitude South, which pointed toward Calais. But it was Fortitude South that would carry the heaviest burden. Because this wasn't just about planting false information. It was about creating a second army, one that didn't exist. In the spring of 1944, across southeastern England, a vast military presence began to materialize. Troops gathered. Supply depots expanded. Tanks and landing craft assembled in staging areas. To German reconnaissance aircraft flying high above the channel, the buildup was unmistakable. An invasion force was massing near Dover. Exactly where logic said it should be. But almost none of it was real. The tanks were inflatable rubber, designed by British set designers and artists. From the air they looked identical to the American Sherman tanks. The landing craft were plywood frames painted to resemble the real vessels. The supply depots were stacks of empty crates. The airfields were gravel runways with fake aircraft, wooden frames covered in canvas, positioned carefully to cast the right shadows. And the scale was staggering. Hundreds of dummy tanks. Dozens of false artillery pieces. Entire fictional regiments, complete with insignia, unit designations, and command structures. But deception isn't just about what you show. It's about what you say. And more importantly, what you allow to be overheard. Allied radio operators began transmitting thousands of messages each day. Orders for fuel shipments. Requests for medical supplies. Routine communications between fictional units. The content didn't matter. What mattered was the volume, the consistency, the patterns. German signals intelligence was sophisticated. They could triangulate radio transmissions, identify unit call signs, track movement through communication patterns. So the Allies fed them exactly what they expected to hear. The radio signature of a massive army preparing for an assault on Calais. Every message was carefully scripted. Every call sign belonged to a unit that existed only on paper. The operators worked in shifts, maintaining the illusion 24 hours a day. If the Germans intercepted a message about a supply shipment, they would later intercept a follow-up confirming delivery. If a fictional colonel requested reinforcements, a fictional general would respond. The consistency was what made it believable. Real armies generate chaos and bureaucracy. So the Phantom Army did the same. But the most brilliant element wasn't technical. It was human. At the center of Fortitude South was a man the Germans already feared. General Georges Patton. Patton was a problem for the Allies. Brilliant, aggressive, and utterly unpredictable. He had led the American forces through North Africa and Sicily with a ferocity that terrified the enemy. German intelligence considered him the most dangerous commander in the Allied ranks. They believed, correctly, that wherever Patton went, the main attack would follow. So the Allies put him in charge of the Phantom Army. On paper, Patton commanded the 1st United States Army Group, known as Fusag. It was supposedly the largest Allied formation in Britain, positioned in southeastern England, directly across from Calais. In reality, Fusag didn't exist. But Patton did. And the Germans tracked his every move. He gave speeches to non-existent troops. He toured fake bases. He attended meetings with Allied commanders that were deliberately held in locations where German spies could observe him. His presence was the cornerstone of the deception. Because if Patton was in Dover, the invasion had to be aimed at Calais. The psychological impact was profound. German commanders weren't just analyzing troop movements or radio signals. They were analyzing Patton. His reputation preceded him. His aggression. His impatience. If the Allies were planning a bold, direct strike across the shortest route, Patton would lead it. That logic seemed unshakable. And so even as Allied forces began boarding real ships in Portsmouth and Southampton, heading toward Normandy, the German High Command kept the bulk of their armored divisions near Calais. Waiting. Watching. Preparing for an attack that would never come. But deception at this scale couldn't rely on hope. It required reinforcement. Constant, relentless reinforcement. Which meant the Allies needed something even more dangerous than fake tanks or false radio signals. They needed double agents. In the world of intelligence, the most valuable asset isn't the spy who steals secrets. It's the spy who feeds them. A double agent, working under enemy control but loyal to the other side, becomes a channel. And if that channel is trusted, it can carry poison. By 1944, British intelligence had turned nearly every German spy operating in the United Kingdom. Through a combination of arrests, blackmail, and ideological persuasion, they had created a network of double agents, codenamed the Double Cross System. These agents continued sending reports back to their German handlers. But the information they sent was carefully controlled by British intelligence. One of the most critical agents was a Spaniard codenamed Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia. Before the war, he had been a hotel manager with no intelligence training. But he hated fascism and he had a gift for storytelling. Pujol had convinced German intelligence that he was operating a spy network across Britain. In reality, he worked alone in Lisbon, inventing fictional sub-agents and fabricating reports based on publicly available information. His reports were so detailed, so convincing, that the Germans considered him one of their most reliable sources. When British intelligence discovered him, they immediately saw his value. They brought him to London and began feeding him real intelligence, mixed with carefully crafted lies. In the months leading up to D-Day, Garbo sent dozens of messages to his German handlers. He reported on troop movements near Dover. He described conversations overheard in pubs. He provided details on supply shipments and training exercises. All of it pointed toward Calais. The brilliance was in the timing. Garbo's information was often accurate. He would report something true, a unit relocation, a convoy departure, but frame it in a way that supported the deception. This built trust. And once that trust was established, he could deliver the critical lie. On June 5, the night before the Normandy invasion, Garbo sent an urgent message to his handlers. He warned that an Allied operation was imminent. But he said it too late for the Germans to act. The message arrived after the invasion fleet had already sailed. From the German perspective, Garbo had tried to warn them, but circumstances prevented timely delivery. This reinforced his credibility. He wasn't a liar. He was a loyal agent working under difficult conditions. Then, on June 9, 3 days after D-Day, Garbo sent the message that changed everything. He reported that Normandy was a diversion. The real invasion, the main assault, was still coming. At Calais, led by Patton and Fusag, the Germans had to hold their armored divisions in reserve. If they moved them to Normandy, they would leave the true target undefended. And the Germans believed him. Even as Allied forces fought desperately to expand the Normandy beachhead, even as casualties mounted and the battle hung in precarious balance, the German High Command kept 15 divisions near Calais, waiting, watching for Patton. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The Allies had established a foothold. Reinforcements were pouring in. The window to crush the invasion had closed. Garbo was later awarded an Iron Cross by the Germans for his service. He never collected it, because by then the British had already given him their own medal. He was one of the few people in history to be decorated by both sides of the same war. But even as the deception succeeded, there was another layer. One that went beyond dummy tanks and double agents. It was the thing Churchill understood instinctively when he made his bland, forgettable announcement. Silence itself was a weapon. In the weeks before D-Day, the Allies imposed a communications blackout across southern England. Mail was censored. Journalists were restricted. Troop movements occurred at night. Entire regions became information dead zones. The goal wasn't secrecy. The Germans already knew something was coming. The goal was uncertainty. When information is abundant, patterns emerge. Intelligence analysts can connect data points, identify trends, predict intentions. But when information is scarce, the mind fills the gaps. And the Allies had spent months filling those gaps with lies. The Germans intercepted radio signals from Fusag. They saw aerial photos of fake tanks. They received reports from double agents. All of it pointed toward Calais. But they also heard nothing about Normandy. No radio chatter. No agent reports. No visual confirmation of a massive buildup. And that absence, paradoxically, made Normandy seem unimportant. Because if the Allies were planning a major operation, surely there would be signs. Surely they couldn't hide an entire invasion force. But they could. By making the real operation invisible and the fake operation loud. This wasn't just tactical deception. It was cognitive warfare. The Allies understood something fundamental about how human beings process information. We trust patterns. We believe what fits our expectations. And when presented with two possibilities, one that aligns with our assumptions and one that doesn't, we instinctively choose the familiar. The Germans expected the invasion at Calais. So that's what they saw. Even when the evidence pointed elsewhere. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the German commanders faced a nightmare. Their enemy had landed. But where was the main attack? Reports flooded in. Paratroopers behind the lines. Naval bombardment along the Normandy coast. Amphibious landings across 5 beaches. It looked enormous. It looked decisive. But the intelligence reports said otherwise. Garbo and other double agents insisted this was a feint. Patton's forces hadn't moved. Fusag was still in Dover. The big strike was still coming. Field Marshal Rommel, responsible for coastal defense, wanted to commit the armored reserves immediately. Crush the Normandy landings before they could consolidate. But the High Command hesitated. What if Rommel was wrong? What if they moved the panzers south and the real invasion hit Calais? The delay was measured in hours. But in war, hours can decide everything. By the time the armored divisions received orders to move, Allied air superiority had locked down the roads. German reinforcements crawled toward Normandy under constant bombing. What should have been a rapid counterattack became a slow, grinding advance. The Allies gained time. They dug in. They brought in reinforcements. And the window to throw them back into the sea closed forever. The deception didn't end the war. Normandy was still brutal. Thousands of Allied soldiers died on those beaches. The campaign dragged on for months. But fortitude gave them a chance. It forced the enemy to fight with one hand tied behind their back, always wondering if the real blow was still coming. In the months after D-Day, German intelligence continued to believe in Fusag. They tracked Patton's movements obsessively. When he finally took command of a real army and drove across France, they treated it as confirmation. This was the force they'd been waiting for. Even then, even after Normandy had proven decisive, the Phantom Army continued to haunt their decisions. Fortitude wasn't unique. It was part of a larger understanding that was reshaping war itself. Throughout history, armies had fought over terrain, resources, fortifications. Victory went to whoever had more soldiers, better weapons, stronger walls. But by the mid-20th century, a new kind of battlefield had emerged. One that existed in the mind. Psychological operations. Information warfare. Deception campaigns. These weren't tricks on the margins of war. They were central to it. Because modern warfare depended on coordination, logistics, intelligence. And all of those things depended on communication. On knowing where the enemy was, what they intended when they would strike. If you could control that knowledge, or corrupt it, you could win without firing a shot. Consider the scale of what the Allies achieved. They created a fictional army of over 1 million men. They sustained that fiction for months, under the scrutiny of one of the most sophisticated intelligence organizations in the world. They convinced the enemy to make catastrophic decisions based on information that was entirely false. And they did it using tools that most people would never consider weapons. Radio sets, paint and canvas, rumors and whispers, the appearance of normalcy. This was a new kind of power. One that didn't rely on physical force but on perception. On making the enemy see what you wanted them to see, believe what you wanted them to believe. And once that door opened, it never closed. After the war, the details of Fortitude remained classified for decades. The dummy tanks were dismantled. The double agents disappeared into new identities. The radio operators returned to civilian life. For years, the official history of D-Day focused on courage, sacrifice, and firepower. It was a story of men storming beaches under withering fire. And that was true. But it was incomplete. When the files were finally declassified in the 1970s, historians began to piece together the full picture. And what they found was astonishing. The deception had been so effective, so deeply embedded, that German commanders continued to believe in Fusag even after the war ended. Prisoners of war, interrogated by Allied intelligence, still insisted that Patton's ghost army existed. They had seen the reports. They had tracked the radio signals. The evidence was overwhelming. Except it wasn't evidence. It was theater. And the implications were profound. Because if an entire enemy command could be fooled so completely, so persistently, what did that mean for the nature of truth in war? How could any commander trust their intelligence? How could any nation be certain of what they knew? The answer, disturbingly, was that they couldn't. Fortitude proved that reality itself could be weaponized. That perception was as important as fact. And that in the hands of skilled operators, lies could be more powerful than truth. Churchill's boring announcement wasn't a failure of rhetoric. It was a masterpiece of restraint. By refusing to dramatize the moment, by stripping away the emotion and grandeur, he protected the operation itself. Because spectacle draws attention. And attention invites scrutiny. The real lesson of Fortitude isn't about technology or tactics. It's about understanding human nature. We see what we expect to see. We believe what fits our worldview. And when someone we trust tells us something, especially something that confirms our assumptions, we rarely question it. The Germans weren't stupid. They weren't incompetent. They were simply human. And the Allies exploited that humanity with ruthless precision. War has always been about more than guns and bombs. It's about will. About belief. About the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we believe about the enemy. Fortitude was a reminder that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you can see. It's the one that changes what you think you see. In an age where information moves at the speed of light, where images can be fabricated and voices can be cloned, where entire narratives can be constructed and dismantled in hours, the lessons of Fortitude are more relevant than ever. Because the battlefield has moved. It's no longer just on the ground or in the air. It's in our minds. In what we know, what we believe, and what we're willing to question. Churchill understood this. When he stood in that bunker and delivered his flat, unremarkable announcement, he wasn't downplaying history. He was shaping it. By making the truth sound ordinary, he protected the lie that had already been planted. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the quietest voice carries the heaviest blow. The tanks rolling through Normandy were real. The soldiers fighting and dying on those beaches were real. But the army that kept 15 German divisions paralyzed near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come, was a ghost. A phantom. A weapon made of nothing but words, images, and belief. And it was just as deadly as any bomb.